Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our webinar, Clinical Trials Demystified. I'm Teresa Blondin, the National Volunteer and Program Manager here at Bladder Cancer Canada, and I'm honored to be facilitating this session tonight. I'm so happy that you're all here joining us to delve into some of the misconceptions surrounding clinical trials and to hear a firsthand account of what it's like to be enrolled in a clinical trial. At Bladder Cancer Canada, we believe that education empowers patients and can help facilitate and increase quality of life for people affected by bladder cancer, and that is what tonight is all about. Please remember that webinars contain content intended for the sole purpose of information sharing and should not be considered medical advice. Always talk to your doctor and/or urologist about what is best for you. And if you run into any issues, myself and Shasa Boshoff, the National Development Manager, are monitoring the chat and happy to help. So now I'm honored to introduce our presenters for the night. We have Tony Cornacchia. He's an active volunteer with Bladder Cancer Canada and previously the vice president of our board of directors. And he's an active spokesperson for our organization. He's always happy to share his story and educate others, and we're honored to have him here tonight. And of course, Dr. Peter Black is here as well. He's an active member of the Bladder Cancer Canada community as the chair of our medical advisory board, a urologic oncologist at Vancouver General Hospital, a senior research scientist and associate director of clinical research at the Vancouver Prostate Center, and a professor in the Department of Urological Sciences at the University of British Columbia. So thank you both for giving us your time tonight. I'll pass it over to Dr. Black to kick things off.
Terrific. Thank you, Teresa. I will share my screen. I'm very happy to be here and doing this with you all. Very passionate about clinical trials, and of course, anything that we on the medical side can do to demystify is super important. Although I find when I start talking about things, sometimes it becomes more confusing rather than less. So stick with me. I will go over a little bit just what clinical trials are, a little bit of background, why we do them. I'll highlight to you some of the mechanics of enrolling in a trial and what happens when you're in a trial. And then along the way, for both these parts, I'll cite some examples. And I'm going to end up with an example which is, I think, very interesting and leads into Tony's story. Tony is taking part in a trial, and he will speak from the patient perspective after me, and then we can open up for questions. So what are clinical trials? First of all, I'd like to highlight that not all clinical research is a clinical trial. So as a patient in the various hospitals and systems, you may have a consent put in front of you asking you to participate in research, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a trial. In a trial, we are doing something to change an individual patient's care to affect an outcome. So there's some kind of intervention, but a lot of research is simply observational. We have, for example, the Canadian Bladder Cancer Information System, where we're simply tracking patient data, treatments, and outcomes, but we're not changing anything. Or Dr. Kulkarni in Toronto is measuring quality of life in patients in different disease scenarios, but again, not intervening. And we often collect specimens from patients who are having surgery or chemotherapy or something else. Again, that's not a trial, but it is important clinical research. So trials are measuring interventions, and really everything that we do in patient care, whether it is giving a medication, performing a cystoscopy, ordering a CT scan, doing a surgery, every step of the way ideally would be evidence-based. Of course, it is not. A lot of what we do, especially in the surgical realm, is based on expert opinion, what we think is best. We go back to best principles, how we understand the world, and we design strategies around that. And we, as a community, agree that's probably the best way. And a good example for all of you who've had routine cystoscopies is the frequency at which we do cystoscopy in a patient who's had a prior bladder tumor. You know, you could say it's more or less made up. It's not really driven by clinical trial evidence, but of course it's based on what we know about when patients recur. So clinical trials are the formal way of testing a new intervention, a new treatment. Most often we think of a new drug to provide the real evidence we need to change what is established practice. And from a physician's perspective, it is, it's an essential step to change something. It's not always treatment. I put the asterisks in there, maybe a biomarker, maybe a scan of some sort. But we need to compare the new with the established in order to improve patient care. So it's always about incremental benefits to patient care, which is what we're trying to do. From a patient's perspective, I think this is my view on what the patient should think, is that it should be viewed as an opportunity to receive better treatment, to get something that you might not get in the standard of care that might be better than the standard of care. Many treatments in trials end up becoming standard of care, but with some delay. And so as a patient, you have an opportunity for early access to effective treatments and more options, especially in advanced cancer, metastatic cancer. The goal is often to go through a series of treatments, and the more options you have, the better. The negative, of course, is the risk of side effects and of whatever that new treatment might be. And there is an element of altruism. I think that you don't know until the trial results are published whether it actually was beneficial or not. So as an individual patient entering a trial, some of what you're contributing is establishing new protocols for future patients. So I've highlighted some myths. There are 4 myths that I've embedded throughout the talk, but one of the clinical trial myths is that participating in a clinical trial will not help me as the individual patient. And I think this, there's always a risk that it won't help you, but in most cases, it does help you. And again, I'm looking forward to Tony's story at the end, which really gives such a clear example of this. But in many trials, we know that the drugs are effective from more advanced disease states, and we're just bringing it earlier in the disease course. And so there's a real potential for the trial to be beneficial to the individual patient. We also need to recognize, which I'll come back to later, is that you generally get better quality care if you're on a trial. You have a trial coordinator who's watching out for you every step of the way. Everything is done by the book, the scans, the scopes, all the treatments, it's all documented and done very carefully. So there are real advantages to you as an individual, and it's not just about who's coming after you. So it's important to understand the 4 phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 trials are, they test drugs for the first time in patients, in people. Sometimes they're not patients, sometimes they're normal, not normal, but healthy patients without any specific disease, where the drugs are tested for side effects. In the cancer phase 1 trials, typically you have a small sample size, and you're really just trying to establish the dose for the medication. You start low and you incrementally increase the dose until you reach a level where the side effects are either a problem or you've reached what you think is the maximal reasonable dose. The phase 2 trial is a bigger trial, but generally still quite small, that traditionally has been all about testing that dose that you found in phase 1 and demonstrating in a larger patient cohort that it's safe. So focus on safety. But of course, these days, you also want some indication that the drug works so that you can justify a bigger and ultimately much more expensive phase 3 trial. So there's definitely a need to look at drug efficacy or treatment efficacy in phase 2. And then phase 3, those are the big definitive trials where you almost always, not always, but almost always have a comparison between 2 groups or more groups, where you're trying to establish a new treatment or new intervention compared to an old that's already used in routine practice. And a positive phase 3 trial leads to practice change. Then phase 4, I think, is less, well, it's less relevant for this audience. There aren't a lot of phase 4 trials in bladder cancer. But this is really real world evidence that is collected after the drug is already approved by the regulatory authorities, so by Health Canada for us. And sometimes it delves into specific patient populations. Sometimes it's simply longer follow-up. And we know that patients in the real world perform differently than patients on trials because there's always a selection bias on trials. On trials, you tend to have the fittest, healthiest patients. Often they are better educated. Often they are higher socioeconomic class, so they have more money, more education. So it can make a difference, and we need to see how drugs perform in the real world. So let me give you an example of a phase 1 trial. So back in approximately 2012-13, immunotherapy, so immune checkpoint therapy, was coming online. And one of the drugs, atezolizumab, was one of the first out of the gates being tested in various cancers. It targeted a specific molecule, PD-L1, that regulated the immune system and allowed tumors to avoid the immune system. And bladder cancer was on the radar of the company developing this drug because it was thought to be an immunogenic tumor that would likely respond to immunotherapy. Plus, at the time, there were no good options for bladder cancer other than just chemotherapy. So it seemed like a good opportunity. And so in the phase 1 trial, they tested the drug for the first time ever in a mixed group of patients with different cancers, but it included metastatic bladder cancer that had progressed on immunotherapy. And even though it was a small trial, and I told you that phase 1 is all about safety and not efficacy, this actually showed some remarkable efficacy in the small group of patients and very good safety results, better than we would anticipate from chemotherapy, so that it triggered an avalanche of following trials with this drug and other drugs that have changed how we treat bladder cancer. So it all starts with a phase 1 to demonstrate safety, find dose and demonstrate safety. Now, phase 2, I want to go in a completely different direction for phase 2, and I recognize some names in the audience, so I know at least one person has been through this. But phase 2 trials are commonly done right now for patients with high-grade non-muscle invasive bladder cancer that recurs after BCG therapy, so the so-called BCG unresponsive. And the standard of care for these patients is to remove the bladder. But of course, it's a major surgery with major implications for quality of life. Some patients are not really eligible for surgery based on their general health, but many more would prefer to try something else before they commit to such a big surgery. And in this setting, there is no standard of care other than bladder removal. And you cannot really do a trial comparing to bladder removal because patients would not accept that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but the experience would be that a patient is not going to allow you to randomize the patient to surgery versus a drug into the bladder to preserve the bladder. So the ideal trial design to move things forward was a single arm trial. So all patients got the drug. There was no comparison to any other treatment. But I say drug, but whatever the treatment is, there's no comparison to anything else, just to historic controls. And then within the non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, it had to be limited to the subset of patients who had carcinoma in situ, which is a specific type of non-muscle invasive cancer that we think is not completely removed with surgery, with the transurethral resection. So the only way to get rid of carcinoma in situ is for the drug to get rid of it. So you have a group of patients, there's nothing that you're comparing them to. You're putting drug in the bladder or whatever treatment you're giving, and then you're simply measuring how many are cured of their cancer. And trial success is then determined by the proportion of patients who respond to treatment and stay disease-free for at least 12 months with acceptable toxicity. And of course, the one example of this, which is ongoing across Canada, is the Theralase trial that involves photodynamic therapy. So you put a drug into the bladder, not a drug, you put a photosensitizer into the bladder, you shine a laser source into the bladder, and it activates the photosensitizer and kills the cancer cells. So it's a classic phase 2 trial. And then phase 3, this one I like to share because this is one of the best trial results that any of us has ever seen. The classic phase 3, as I said, is a large trial that really has the potential to change how we deliver care. In this case, it will dramatically change bladder cancer care in the very near future. So this is for patients with metastatic or locally advanced bladder cancer. And the standard first line for more than 20 years has been chemotherapy. And for approximately, I don't know how long, maybe 7 years or so, it's the second line therapy is immunotherapy. And then for the past couple of years, the third line therapy is enfortumab vedotin, which is a special sort of Trojan horse drug that targets a specific molecule on the surface of bladder cancer and then delivers the chemo into the cancer cells. So there are 3 lines. You get chemo first, then immunotherapy, then enfortumab. Very sort of systematic, one after the other approach. But in this trial, the EV302 trial, it was a large cohort. You can see in the middle here, almost 900 patients with metastatic bladder cancer were randomized 1-to-1. So half the patients got the new treatment, half the patients got the old treatment of chemotherapy is the established treatment versus a combination of what is ultimately the second and the third line treatment. So the pembrolizumab is the immunotherapy, current second line. The enfortumab vedotin is the current third line. They were given together and compared to chemotherapy in the first line setting. And these results were presented just, I guess, in September or October at a meeting in Madrid, and they haven't been published yet. But you will rarely see 2 lines on a survivor. This is progression-free survival curve separate as much as this, where the blue line is progression with the new combination versus the gray line is progression with chemotherapy. And there's a 55% reduction in risk of progression or death with the new treatment. So a massive improvement in first-line standard of care for patients with metastatic bladder cancer. When this was presented at the meeting, there was a standing ovation from the couple of thousand people in the audience who saw this result. It was so astounding. But this is what we like to do with phase 3 trials. I, of course, show you the best example, but the idea is to really change practice by comparing new to old in a large number of patients, giving a very robust finding. So clinical trial number 2, myth number 2 is the providers will treat me like a guinea pig. And of course, that is far from the truth. I think we need to understand how carefully all new treatments are vetted before they ever make it into patients. If anybody was a guinea pig, you may consider, if you're involved in a phase 1 trial, you may consider yourself a guinea pig because it's the first time that a drug is tested in patients. Those trials are typically only done in the latest stages when there are no other alternatives. But even then, the drugs are being carefully tested in preclinical models and in animal models. They go through very stringent Health Canada approval before we can do the trial. Every trial is approved by Health Canada. They go through ethics approval at the institution, and often they go through peer review as well. So nobody is a guinea pig. The trial framework and infrastructure is very rigorous. And you can see as for example, in the phase 3 trial that I just showed you, it's only a small proportion of patients who are involved in any phase 1 trial. It's these big phase 3 trials that involve the most patients, and that is far from being a guinea pig. So I wanted just to show to you also how trials or new treatments tend to progress from the most advanced disease state to earlier disease states by sequential trials. And this is important also because we usually know once the first trial is done in the most advanced disease state, we actually know the safety and efficacy of that drug. And it's just a matter of seeing if it offers an advantage in an earlier disease state, maybe with a different combination. But we are working with a drug that we know works and we know is safe. So typically, as I said, we start with a patient population that doesn't have a lot of other options. We then go one step earlier in the disease spectrum. If it was beneficial, so again, I'm thinking here of immunotherapy. It was first tested after chemotherapy as a second-line option when patients had nothing else. There was nothing after chemotherapy, and it proved very effective. So it only made sense that it was then tested in the first-line setting. So it was tested in comparison to chemotherapy, so immunotherapy versus chemotherapy, but also in addition, so immunotherapy plus chemotherapy versus chemotherapy. And of course, if it works for metastatic bladder cancer, well, why would it not work for non-metastatic bladder cancer? In this case, muscle-invasive bladder cancer in patients having their bladder removed. So it's tested before, meaning neoadjuvant, or after cystectomy, meaning adjuvant. And immunotherapy is currently approved in the second line, the first line, and the adjuvant setting. It is not yet approved in neoadjuvant setting and won't be imminently. We need more trial results there. And of course, it can also go to the non-muscle invasive setting. So the very same drug that was proved effective in second line metastatic is also now approved in patients who recur after BCG. And there are trials underway or completed, but not yet reported, looking at immunotherapy in patients with first-line treatment with BCG or instead of, with BCG, not instead of. So it's gone from the very latest stage of the disease all the way up to the very first stage of the disease. And that's the typical course. And of course, just thinking of, what's in it for me as a patient, or am I a guinea pig? There's obviously clear benefits, potential benefits to a treatment that we know works well in other disease states. This just shows the same again, where you start with metastatic, and we didn't used to have anything more than second line. Now we have established third line, and we have multiple options in third line, but it moves forward. So immunotherapy started second line, went to first line, where we have switch maintenance avelumab. We have adjuvant nivolumab. There are trials underway for neoadjuvant and concurrent, so at the same time as TMT is radiation-based therapy. It's approved for BCG unresponsive, and it's being tested in the earlier non-muscle invasive disease states. So myth number 3, that clinical trials are only for really sick patients. This again is the implication that it's only for patients who are, heading towards palliative care, who've exhausted all their options, and there's nothing left. And that, again, is far from the truth. Only some patients who are in the early phase trials are in that type of trial. The vast majority of trials are for fit, well patients who are looking to expand their treatment options. And as I alluded to, clinical trials actually usually select for healthier, fitter patients than the general population. I want to highlight that trials are not just for drugs. I keep talking about drugs, but it's not just for drugs. We do surgical trials, we do radiation trials, we do biomarker trials. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over most of this slide, just so you know, a lot of different things can be done. One example of a surgical trial is this one that was, again, has not been published yet, but was presented at a meeting earlier in the year. It's called S1011, so a SWOG trial, 1011, included Canadian sites, for example, West Kasuth and at McGill, and we here at UBC accrued a lot of patients to this. But we know when we're removing the bladder for muscle-invasive bladder cancer, we remove lymph nodes on both sides of the pelvis. We peel out fatty tissue that we send to the pathologist to see if lymph nodes are involved. And there's a lot of evidence, there was a lot of evidence suggesting that doing a little bit more, so an extended node dissection, was better than doing a little bit less, a standard node dissection. So patients were living longer if you took the time to remove more lymph nodes. But it was low quality evidence. It was retrospective studies. We had a study here, for example, in Vancouver, where we simply looked at our own experience and approximately 500 cases, who had standard, who had extended, what was the outcome. And of course, there are always confounding variables there that influence the outcome. So it's something that really needed to be addressed by a prospective randomized trial. And so 1011 did it. There's no drug company behind this. It's a very simple surgical question. And SWOG is a cooperative group sponsored by the National Cancer Institute in the US. And it was a very simple question: extended versus standard lymph node dissection. And the results were reported in June. And very interesting, there was not even a hint of difference in disease-free survival between extended versus standard. I'm sparing you the curves here because there's just no difference. But there was an increased risk of complications with the extended dissection, and there was actually an increased risk of death within 90 days after surgery from the extended dissection. So a massive downside without any benefit. And we were all completely convinced that we were doing the right thing by offering extended dissection, and we would criticize those who weren't doing it. And we were completely wrong. It was a negative trial that immediately changed practice. So we all stopped doing extended lymph node dissection after this trial. So it's important to do surgical trials as well. Some trials are nearly impossible or actually impossible. And we give the English credit for trying to do the very difficult trials and often succeeding. But it's very difficult to randomize patients between two very different treatments when both the patient and the physician have some pre-existing bias for one over the other. So we need equipoise. We need, especially the physician, to completely believe that you don't know which is better, and you're doing the trial because you need to figure out which is better. But if you have a surgeon talking to a patient and the surgeon thinks the bladder needs to be removed, then it's very difficult to describe the trial to the patient in a manner that's not biased towards surgery. And so these two trials were very interesting in the UK. One attempted to randomize to radical cystectomy versus chemoradiation for muscle-invasive bladder cancer, and it failed to randomize enough patients. And the second attempted to randomize patients to cystectomy, so removal of the bladder, versus BCG for T1 bladder cancer, so early non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, and it too failed because the question was just, or the options were too disparate, and patients and physicians were not really willing to allow that decision to be left to chance and randomization. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of clinical trials. Sorry, I just got to check my time here. The identifying a clinical trial for yourself is a major challenge. I think it's a major challenge. If I'm asked to find a trial for a family member in Toronto, for example, I would also find it challenging. It's not completely straightforward to get up-to-date data on exactly what is going on. So you start by asking your treating physician. So in this case, your treating urologist if it's non-muscle invasive or muscle invasive bladder cancer, or your medical oncologist if systemic therapy is involved. But often they won't necessarily know. I wouldn't expect a community urologist, for example, here in BC, to necessarily know what trials are going on. Some of those urologists would reach out to someone like myself and say, hey, what trials are you doing? You as a patient can certainly reach out to the major referral centers and say, hey, what trials are you doing? But there are also some online resources. Of course, Bladder Cancer Canada in their webpage have links to multiple other sites. I think everything I've listed here, otherwise on this slide, is on the Bladder Cancer Canada page. The go-to gold standard is the clinicaltrials.gov, which is a US site that most places around the world who are rigorous in doing their trials will post them at clinicaltrials.gov. But it's not necessarily updated as much as you would like, and it doesn't, for example, necessarily always list comprehensively where the trial is being offered. There are other ones. The Canadian Urologic Association has started one, a new one, and I would, this is my feedback to Teresa, that we should add this to the Bladder Cancer Canada page, because they're actually making an effort to keep it up to date and list Canadian sites offering trials. So I think that's important. And then just another couple mentioned on the slide there. So if you have a trial that you're interested in and planning to take part in, then it's quite a process. So there's a screening process where, so I, as your treating urologist, might say, yeah, I think you'll meet criteria for this trial. I tell you about the trial, you say that sounds very interesting, let's explore it further. And then we actually pull out the checklists and we start looking at the inclusion and exclusion criteria. There might be little things. Maybe you had a dose of chemotherapy 21 months ago, but the trial excludes anybody who's had chemotherapy within the last 2 years. So little things like that we need to look at very, very carefully. There may be blood work, there may be imaging. Maybe you had a CAT scan 2 months ago, but the trial says it has to be within a month and you need another CAT scan. So there are some hoops that you have to jump through at the beginning of a trial. There's then the process of informed consent, where we especially have to highlight the anticipated side effects and impact of the standard treatment and the anticipated difference with the new treatment and what additional toxicity there might be. And then you're randomized if it's a higher stage trial, which means you're assigned to one treatment arm or the other. And as I'll highlight later, it's really important going into a trial that you know ahead of time that you will be happy regardless of which treatment you get. Otherwise, it's maybe not a good idea to take part. So you start the study treatment, and then there's a lot of monitoring. So you're monitored for how well the drug works with scans, especially CT scans, also blood tests. There will be a very specific study calendar when everything is done, and windows plus minus 2 or 3 days of when things have to happen. So it's very regimented care, which also is one of the reasons why you actually get enhanced care on a clinical trial. You'll also be asked a lot about side effects to make sure that we're capturing any unexpected side effects or severe side effects. And at some point, you'll come off trial. Sometimes you come off trial because of a side effect and you have to stop drug treatment. Sometimes a recurrence or progression, or sometimes because you've completed trial, you've met the endpoint and the trial is simply done. But there are different criteria for end of trial. And there are a lot of other sort of nuances that I'd like to mention. So maybe more than nuances, but important consideration is travel distance for trial. Do you have to live within 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 500 kilometers? How many visits are there involved? And do you have the financial means to get to these visits? I know of Canadian patients who fly to the US for a clinical trial. Those are obviously the wealthy few who can afford to do that. Most patients are thinking about how they're going to pay for the gas and the parking, because there are additional out-of-pocket expenses. Some trials will cover these additional costs, and that's always a question worth asking. Super important to recognize that you can always withdraw from a trial at any time, and that should be emphasized in the informed consent process. It's not a contract, you're not bound to anything. But I would highlight that you only want to enroll if you're confident in options. If you sign up for a trial hoping to get treatment A, but plan to abort the trial if you get treatment B, you will have a hugely negative impact on the trial, because the trial results always report by intention to treat, meaning your outcome will count as if you got that treatment A you were supposed to get, no matter what else happens to you. So you have to be comfortable with the options, and hopefully you'll stick to whatever treatment you were assigned to. I always refer to the special care you get on trial as sort of a concierge service, where you have a clinical trial coordinator who's really navigating your care and improving your care. I've said that already a couple of times. And I think patient confidentiality is important. So trial results usually are published in some way, but never with an indication of individual patient data. And if it's a trial done...
Okay, I found this on the web for if you're confident in the treatment options if you sign up.
Sorry, my whatever Siri's talking to me. If it's a multi-center trial, that your data will be entered in a database to later compile the trial results, but it's always done in an anonymized fashion. For the database, you are a number, and only the trial manager at your site is able to match the name to the number. So getting close to an end here, but one other big issue is the issue of placebos and blinding. And I think there's a lot of controversy around placebos, and a lot of use of placebos is actually considered unethical, and I think its use is much more restricted than it used to be. The idea is that if you as a patient know what you're getting, and if I have as a physician know what I'm giving you, that can lead to bias that can influence outcomes. You can expect an outcome because you know what you're getting, and then you're more likely to have that outcome, or I order the tests in such a way that it will favor whatever outcome we're looking at. So it's really, ideally, in a scientific way, you want to avoid anybody knowing what they're getting. So a placebo is sometimes used so that the patient and the physician don't know what they're getting. When the physician doesn't know, it's called blinding. Well, in both cases, it's called blinding, but ideally it's double blinded, where neither the physician or the patient knows exactly what treatment the patient is getting. You can imagine, for example, if you're getting immunotherapy, which is an IV infusion, if you're getting that, if half the patients get that and half the patients get nothing, well, it's very clear that you're getting immunotherapy because you're going for your infusion every 2 to 3 weeks, and the patient who's not coming is not getting anything. And so that can bias results. I'm going to show you a good example of that. Importantly, though, you as a patient will always know if there's a placebo involved. It'll never be hidden. And you will always know what the likelihood is that you have a placebo. Maybe it's 1 in 3, 1 in 2, whatever that is, you will always know. It'll never be a secret. And so clinical trial myth number 4 is I'll only get a placebo, and that, of course, is wrong. But I'd like to highlight these trials to show you how important a placebo can be. And while we think it adds undue burden to patients to have to come in, for example, for an intravenous infusion every 2 weeks that is actually just sodium chloride, it may be super critical in demonstrating benefit of a drug that impacts many patients in the future. So this is an example. If we look on the left-hand side here, IMvigor10 is atezolizumab, so 1 immunotherapy versus observation. So IV infusion every 3 weeks versus staying at home. So they clearly knew what they were getting. Negative trial, 0 difference in disease-free survival. On the other hand, Checkmate 274 was nivolumab, another immunotherapy, versus placebo. So these patients actually were brought into the hospital every 2 weeks for an infusion of saline. But it's a positive trial. There's a difference in disease-free survival here. And nivolumab has become a standard tool that we give after cystectomy based on this trial, whereas if we had the same result with this trial as we had here, that would not be an option for patients. We would have said, it doesn't work, it's not an option, and we move on. So was the placebo and the blinding perhaps the big difference here? And again, we look at the trials, the 2 drugs, observation in this one versus placebo in this one. And the obvious difference is the disease-free survival in the control arm. When patients were blinded, the disease-free survival was low because there's a very low dropout rate. Patients stayed on trial because they didn't know whether they're getting drug or not. But in the IMvigor trial, where patients knew, the ones with the highest risk features left the trial seeking other treatment elsewhere because they knew they weren't getting treatment on trial. And so that, to me, is just a huge example of the potential benefit for placebo, but of course it's complicated when we should include it and when we shouldn't. So this is my final slide before I just segue over to Tony and Tony's story. And I would just make the point that clinical trials are absolutely essential to the advancement of bladder cancer care for patients. It's all done with patients in mind, but it's also done on the backs of patients. So patients carry the burden of what is needed to do the trials. As clinicians, we need to be thinking of trials. We want, if we're not at a center doing trials, we want to be thinking about referring patients as necessary. We want to encourage patients to take part in trials. And we do, if we have a trial here in Vancouver, we will ask the community urologists around us to refer patients for the trial because we think it's an opportunity that they should have. And I recognize that trials are a burden for patients, but I hope that patients also recognize the opportunity, and it's up to us working with patients to try and maximize the opportunity and minimize the burden. And so I just wanted to highlight this one trial that Tony took part in, because I think it was a really interesting trial, and Tony has a really interesting, perspective to give on it. But the results were published in 2020, which means that the trial was being designed at least 5 years before, and immunotherapy was really new on the scene in around 2014. So it was a very early design of trying to move immunotherapy already into the first-line setting in metastatic bladder cancer. And there were two other trials that were also planned or just started that were combining immunotherapy with chemotherapy in the first line. But this trial, the Danube trial, they took a different approach, which I think was fairly bold, meaning potentially risky, in that they had two different immunotherapy drugs that worked in different means. When I say these are, of course, company-driven trials. So if a company has two different drugs, they like to test them together. But it made sense. I don't question the value of combining them. It made sense to combine those versus just one of them alone versus standard chemotherapy. They did not combine immunotherapy with chemotherapy, which seemed like the more logical thing to do. And since they had 3 arms, it was more than 1,000 patient trial, a really big trial. And this just shows you. So durvalumab is the sort of the more familiar immunotherapy alone versus a combination with tremelimumab versus standard of care chemotherapy for metastatic bladder cancer. And you can see the durvalumab alone compared to chemotherapy, actually in the first year or so had worse outcomes. This is overall survival, but then was a little bit better in longer term. This is only the subset of patients who have this protein expressed in their tumor. This is the target of the drug. And so you would think if the target is there, they will do better. But even in this favorable group, immunotherapy was no better than chemotherapy. I would say it's actually pretty good that it was the same as chemotherapy, but that's not how the trial was designed. And then the second primary endpoint of the trial was the combination. So durvalumab plus tremelimumab in green versus chemotherapy in blue. And again, you see that chemotherapy has some benefit in almost everybody, whereas for some patients, immunotherapy is like giving water. It just doesn't do anything. But then in the longer term, the lines cross and the green is above the blue, but not enough that we would say that it works better than chemotherapy. And so this was a negative trial based on the curve I just showed you and this curve. It was a negative trial, and this combination is not used in clinical practice. But then you have this sort of subset analysis, subgroup analysis that isn't part of the main results, and it's not something that can lead to drug approval or anything. But it's very interesting. And if you look again, just at the patients who have the protein expressed in their tumors and got the combination of the two immunotherapies versus chemotherapy, there's actually a very significant difference, so that patients with the combination lived longer, did better than those who got chemotherapy. And so it's compelling, but the trial wasn't designed primarily to address this question. So it's almost like it doesn't count. It would have to be tested again in another trial to be implemented in clinical practice. But of course, there are a lot of patients in this green arm, well, 205 patients who potentially benefited from this combination. And I would bet that Tony was maybe one of them. So I will hand over to Tony at this point to continue, and then I'll come back for the questions.
I was PDL positive, and I had the combination of the two drugs. And documentation, Dr. Black, on the trial started back in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a while before. Thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak. I'm truly honored to be able to share a little bit of my story. I think it's wise to start sort of, everybody's got their own story. Definitely I do. The beginning, I was diagnosed with CIS high grade back in June of 2014. I had my first TURP, my first resection, and my first course of BCG over July, August, and September of 2014. And after the follow-up visit to that BCG, I found out that the cancer was still there, or whether it came back or was never completely cleaned out. It was CIS, like Dr. Black said, so it was very superficial in the first lining of the bladder. So we were very optimistic that we had caught it early, that no tumor had developed at that point. After that first sort of recurrence, or the testing showed that the cancer was still there. So this was done at a suburban hospital in Toronto. I thought, well, if this is going to continue, maybe I should go to the cancer center at Princess Margaret downtown. So I was able to get a referral to Princess Margaret, and was seen by a urologist there. And it's like, well, what do we do at this point? 45 years old, other health issues, obese, diabetes, high blood pressure. So we thought, let's go in and do another TURP, another scrape of the bladder. And that's exactly what we did. We tried BCG again, with the exact same outcome. So further discussions happened after the second surgery. And at that point, we decided that no tumors developed yet, still fairly young, still had the other health issues, and we were content with continuing to scrape the bladder as long as we can until a tumor developed, and then we would sort of cross that bridge. And the plan was always to remove the bladder at some point. And those were discussions at the time between the urologist, myself, and my wife. And it was really a group decision that we made. And I was able to trust the doctor and his sort of recommendations or his discussions. Ultimately, I had to make the decision, but the decision was exactly that: to continue with the scraping of the bladder until such time that we had to remove the bladder. We were all convinced a tumor would form at some point. So that brings us another year and a half or so, 2 more surgeries. I had something called EMDA, which is not used anymore, I found out. And it was just a way of combining BCG treatment with metamycin for anybody that's had metamycin. And it was basically electromodal sort of basting it into the lining of the bladder, I kind of called it at that point. So that's 2 years, and that brings us to the fall of 2016. And at that point, I learned through some more testing that the cancer had spread. It spread to my lymph nodes, and and so it's advanced at that point. I got a call from the oncologist office to come in, so I knew at that point that what I called the game had changed. It went from just bladder cancer that we felt we could treat to now cancer spreading. I had that initial discussion with the oncologist, and at that point, she said that patients that had bladder cancer, where the bladder cancer spread to, like my case, the lymph nodes, on average, those patients survived about 18 months. So 47 years old at the time, I lost my mom to breast cancer at 55 years of old. 55 years old she was when she passed away from breast cancer. My grandfather, her father, died at an even younger age of tongue cancer. So, that things that are going through my mind is, it's the same fate for me. So that average of 18 months, all I heard was 18 months. So that is, now in the back of my head at that point. Standard of care in 2016, as Dr. Black alluded to, was chemotherapy. And what are you thinking about chemotherapy? You're thinking about the nausea, the hair loss, the fatigue, the loss of your taste buds. So those negative thoughts were crossing my mind at the time for sure. And one thing that was important was that's sort of my thinking. My wife's thinking is a little bit more practical. Okay, you know what? Let's take a look at what does this mean? What are our options? What do we take a look at? How do we go forward from here? And then obviously the wise advice and suggestions from the oncologist at that point. Question to the oncologist is, well, what else is out there? You've got chemotherapy with all the side effects that I had mentioned and that I thought of. And she said, well, maybe you'd qualify for a clinical trial. And she had mentioned, she didn't mention Danu but by name at that point, but it was for patients that had advanced disease, or in my case, it had spread to the lymph nodes, that had not had chemotherapy as a treatment option to that point there. And I'm thinking, well, might qualify, well, what does that mean? And to Dr. Black's point about sort of, having to qualify for it, that was exactly one thing that I had to consider. So we talked about that option, and I was open to other options as well. 18 month survival rates, the prospect of all the side effects with chemo. At that point, my main goal is how do I improve that, whether it's marginally, whether it's improving the side effects and the quality of life. So I was open to discussing the clinical trial and other options at that point. And listening to Dr. Black's presentation, it kind of brings back a lot of the thought processes that we were going through at the time as well. So again, keeping in mind chemo as an option, the side effects and all of the things that go along with that. My goal on any consideration at that point was getting sort of a better survival rate with a better quality of life, or trying to improve on some of those side effects. So that's kind of what I'm thinking in the back of my mind. So the more I learned about the clinical trial and what it involved, we had discussions about, well, what does that mean? You are comparing the chemotherapy to what are the pros and cons of the trial, right? So, it showed a lot of promise. It was a phase 3 clinical trial at the time that I joined up for it. It was a 13 cycle treatment plan. So it was every 4 weeks. And so it would last about a year. So it showed a lot of promise. The thing Dr. Black was talking about in terms of receiving better treatment or better quality of care, that struck a chord with me, because it was every 4 weeks that you would see the doctor, every 8 weeks for CT scans, access to the clinical trial team, access to the clinical trial nurse team, but then also the backing of the clinical trial as well. So I thought, okay, well, what is the worst case scenario? Well, worst case scenario is that it doesn't work, and then hopefully not enough damage is caused, that there's always the possibility of going back to the chemo, which was still standard of care at the time. I can speak in hindsight a lot, obviously now at this point, but In 2016, there weren't many options. And if there were other clinical trials, I probably didn't qualify it. It was very specific to qualify for this one with the metastatic disease and the fact that I had had chemo up until that point. So, so the discussion with my wife was sort of, you know, I've thinking the way I'm thinking. She's a little bit more pragmatic. Talked about, okay, you know what, if it doesn't work, we go to chemo. You know, if it does progress, then there's still other treatment options at that point. So we thought long and hard, you know, what do we do? And at the end of the day, we thought, you know, it's worth a try. The 18 months and all the side effects wasn't, you know, very promising. So any chance at improving on those parameters was worth a shot. And we definitely thought, okay, you know what, let's give this a try. Emotions, roller coaster of emotions are crazy. So after we make that decision, then you actually have to get approval to be part of that trial, right? There's no guarantee that you're going to be part of that trial. So, you know, very anxious about, so to Dr. Black's point, we had to submit all of our CTs, all of our clinical reports, and wait for the approval from the clinical trial. And, you know, what happens if they don't accept me? What, you know, that's another thought process that goes through my mind. And this is really, there wasn't much leeway between when the first treatment would start and when I received the approval. It might have been 2 weeks prior to that first treatment at most. And luckily I was accepted into the clinical trial. So that is step one. Part of the clinical trial has presented 3 different choices. One was just normal standard of care of the chemotherapy. The second choice was just the one drug, durvalumab. I'm impressed I can say it without missing a beat. And then the combination, the drug was called Medi at that point. Medi-Tremi was the option of the 2 drugs. Having gone through the first sort of part of that cancer treatment, BCG was short all over Canada in 2014, so I received partial dosage. Now I always go through your mind, you know, was it the reduced dosage that didn't make the BCG work? So when it came to, you know, being chosen for one of those arms, my thinking is, as a big guy, the more is better. Let's go with the 2 drug option for no other reason that it was just an extra drug as well. And that randomization didn't happen until the morning of the first treatment. So again, there's sort of more anxiousness there as well till you learn which part of that trial you go on. But it was, you know, the decision up to that appointment was to take a look at alternative treatments. They showed some promise. You know, I did say to my wife at one point, you know what, kind of take one for the team, see what we can find out. But obviously with the intentions of hopefully benefiting me at the end of the day. It was supposed to last 13 treatments, like I said, and it didn't show very much promise the first couple of treatments. It takes time for that to kick in, I guess. The combination of the drugs were for the first 4 treatments, so that was 16 weeks. So that was, let's call it 3 or 4 months. And then we slowly, and the CTs always showed sort of the enlarged lymph nodes up until that first 3 or 4 months. And then it was only after that point that it showed some stability. And then probably 7 or 8 months after, it showed some response to the treatment as well. It's always had the confidence of the team, you know, that I was in good hands, and it was true. You know, every 4 weeks, the constant surveillance made me feel a lot better. So 13 cycles, I showed a complete response in that first year. You know, what do we do after that first year? And we continued on with it. You know, it was working. I didn't have any side effects. I was able to not miss a day of work with treatments, so we decided just to stay on it. To Dr. Black's point, it wasn't a successful trial. They didn't show us any significant improvement over chemotherapy from a survival rate. So you know, you're reading about that and you're going, well, it's working for me, you know. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But you know what? I'll take it. And I definitely hit the jackpot, because you know, if I was a betting man, I'd bet I wouldn't be here today. But I've shown a complete response to it. I'm considered NED, no evidence of disease, and there's no better outcome than that. The only piece I cannot talk about in Dr. Black's presentation is the end of the trial. I will be hitting 89 or 90 cycles within the next week. I am still on it. It's working. You know, the kind of talk is, if it works, let's not change it. There is going to come a time where we're going to have to deal with the end of the trial. But it has been an extreme success for me, in light of not being sort of a successful trial overall. So that's it for me or the story. And it definitely was an interesting. You know what, I can't hear. It's 9 years from the original diagnosis, 7 when I started the trial, and I'm probably the luckiest man here. So
it's amazing, Tony, for something that was deemed, you know, we're not carrying it forward in clinical practice, but obviously there's a subset of patients that benefit so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, durvalumab has shown some. You know, I'm very interested in a lot of the things that, you know, bladder cancer related, and durvalumab did show some really good promise with some lung cancer patients. So there's always you know, there's always benefits to things for to these trials for somebody, and I was fortunate enough for that.
Well, thank you so much, Tony and Dr. Black. I've heard this story a few times now, Tony, and every time I still get goosebumps. So thank you for sharing. So now we'll open the floor to questions. So if you have any questions for Dr. Black or for Tony, feel free to type them into the chat and I can read them out. I think this was a pretty comprehensive webinar. There were some questions that came in advance, and they've already been answered. The only one that was kind of touched on, but may have a little bit more we can answer on, is how long do these most clinical trials last?
Oh boy, that can be very variable. You know, some trials are really, you know, a neoadjuvant treatment, for example, before surgery, and the endpoint could be the pathologic response at the time of surgery. So it's a 4-month trial, let's say. That would be maybe the shortest. Typically for the trials like Tony is talking about, it will often be until time of progression. So if you have someone like Tony who's off the charts and doesn't progress, it goes on for years and years and years. But otherwise, if you enter a trial, you're on a new drug, and you progress at some time point, then you come off the trial and it ends. There are a lot of treatments have a defined number of cycles or defined period of time. So the actual treatment time is limited. For example, I presented the 2 trials with adjuvant immunotherapy after surgery, and that was 12 months of treatment. So you're only treated for 12 months, but you're followed for years afterwards. So highly variable.
Oh, yeah. So are you still doing excessive lymph node removal, or have you gone back to lesser removal?
Excessive. It was so judgmental. It's extended. So I was a big proponent for years of extended lymph node dissection, and I sensed that this was coming. There was another German trial that wasn't quite as definitive, and so I had backed off a little bit in the last couple of years. But the day of that presentation at ASCO in June, you know, the next day I stopped doing extended, so just standard lymph node dissection.
Dr. Black, if I may ask a question, you know, back in 2014, treatment options were very limited. We saw 2016 with sort of the immunotherapy coming on board and becoming very popular. over the last number of years? Anything that's sort of just really new and kind of in the initial thought stage right now that we can look forward to over the next number of years, or is it still the development of immunotherapy as more of a first line treatment option?
It's a good question. I think something completely revolutionary like immunotherapy, I don't think is necessarily on the horizon. Enfortumab was sort of the next big thing, and the combination of it plus immunotherapy is going to shake up the field, because it will now. So in the US, it already is the standard of care first line treatment. In Canada, it'll take some time for it to get Health Canada approved and then reimbursed at a provincial level. But it will for sure get Health Canada approved. It will for sure be reimbursed, and it's a big change because it changes everything after that. And there are a couple of other drugs that are used, like erdafitinib for targeting FGFR. And there's another drug that is very similar to enfortumab, but it has a different target. And there's one that targets HER2, for example, just to mention another target. So I think we will see new drugs and an incremental benefit. And hopefully we'll be able to identify which patients are likely to benefit from one versus the other, so that a drug that maybe doesn't seem that exciting if you're giving it to everybody, but will work super well, like yourself, the combination, give it to everybody, it didn't really pan out. But if you gave it to patients who have the marker, then it can have a big response. So maybe the biggest next step, now that we have multiple drugs available, is to be able to tailor it to the patient and the tumor.
Okay, a question about being able to take, oh, sorry, I just lost it. A treatment if you had a relapse, or would there be another type of treatment? I think it's for the nivolumab.
Well, it depends what setting. So if that's in metastatic disease, then so no, I mean, if so it sounds like the combination of chemo plus nivolumab was also on a recent trial, and actually also showed real benefit of adding the immunotherapy to the chemotherapy. Just the benefit wasn't as big as the combination of the enfortumab plus immunotherapy. So, but if you've had immunotherapy already, of course, you don't necessarily go to the combination of immunotherapy plus something else. Then you would go to the enfortumab by itself. But I don't have obviously the details to actually comment on that properly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this session. I know we're already over time, so I really appreciate both of you being here. For the new year, we do have some great programming lined up already. In January, Dr. Lori Wood and Dr. Ross Mason will host a session on side effects for bladder cancer treatment, and tentatively scheduled for February is a session on navigating this disability tax credit with Rosemary Hill, and in March, a session on urothelial upper tract carcinoma with Dr. Nathan Wong. So thank you again, Dr. Black and Tony, for sharing this important information with us, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks,
Hope you have
everyone.
a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.